Modern currency systems are often misunderstood, misinterpreted, and just generally not very well understood by most people. In this presentation, I hope to explain to you the few modern currency systems that our global economy has run on over the past 100 or so years and give a glimpse into what the future might hold for modern currency systems. So starting out in pre-1944, we had the gold standard. Paper money was backed and redeemable by and into gold. This was in different forms throughout history. The Romans even had a form of this. The paper money served as an IOU with gold held in a bank vault or by government reserves, so essentially in a government vault. And it was almost like a derivative contract between people. That's paper money. Or it could be seen as, if you know what a second layer is on a cryptocurrency, it could almost be seen as the second layer. So like the Lightning Network for Bitcoin is a faster transaction method. That's the same thing with paper money. Okay, so historically this is the only form of like money, of true money. And it had a relatively inelastic money supply because you can't just, as we know, print millions and trillions of dollars at will. So this helped protect people and supported the trust into the system, frankly. Here's an interesting thing. FX fluctuations still occurred even though there was a gold standard. You would think everybody has their currency pegged to gold. Every currency should stay the same. However, that's not true because foreign exchange still fluctuates because of effects negative or positive trade balance. You're going to see TB. That's what it means. It means trade balance. It means exports minus imports. So if you export a lot, you're going to have a positive trade balance, whereas if you import a lot, you're going to have a negative trade balance. And if you have too much of a negative trade balance, then a country has an economic contraction, reducing the value of the currency slightly and leading to more exports. And that's where the gold system comes into play. However, this could lead to a currency collapse also because of not being able to stay back to gold. And we can see here, this is when both of these currencies, the dollar and the pound exchange, were actually back to gold at this point. And so you see it's relatively flat. However, there are a few times where there are dips, and they are somewhat significant. So there still is foreign exchange fluctuation, even with a gold standard, interestingly enough. How it failed, many people will talk about how a gold standard is terrible, but they sort of fail to recognize that the way that it actually failed was because of fiscal lax behavior, essentially. People needed to print money to finance the Great Depression, we see here, and the debts from World War I and World War II eventually needed to be funded here at the end of this chart. This caused a mass devaluation of currencies compared to gold. All the major currencies in the world were completely devalued as compared to gold, and the governments just decided, yeah, we don't want to do that anymore, really, because of how we don't get to print money. And when governments are given the chance, they really like printing money. Okay, so that brings us to the next system, the Bretton Woods system from 1944 to 1971 approximately. The US dollar was the basis of the system. It was redeemable for gold by foreign governments, but not domestic citizens, interestingly enough. And I should note that all the most major foreign currencies were actually backed to the US dollar. So it's like a double backing. The US dollar is backed by gold, and those foreign currencies are pegged to the US dollar, rather. And the U.S. had massive gold reserves from essentially financing World War I and World War II for the Allies, and not really taking all that much damage in either World War. And then also when they banned gold in the 1930s, it massively increased gold reserves because they were able to buy it at a low price and then inflate the currency and sort of screw people over. So the U.S. economy was in a dominant position, and it was able to set up this system because of that. And then issues with the Bretton Woods system. At the start, the U.S. gold reserves were ample to be backed against United States foreign liabilities, but due to persistent trade deficits, and this is going to become a key throughout the next system, persistent trade deficits for the world reserve currency, gold reserves fell below foreign liabilities. We can see that point here at the crossover point, and the actual breakdown of the system over here when liabilities shot way up. So at the point where you don't have reserves to support a gold standard, that's when things start to break down. And that's when France demanded gold payments. It was $35 for 1 ounce of gold. They said, okay, we're going to give you $35. You need to give us an ounce of gold for every $35 we give you. And the United States pretty much said, no, we can't really do that. We don't have the gold to do that. And then Nixon closed the gold window. But I'd also like to point out here that if we go back to this chart, right around, this is the start of the system, and the United States gold reserves just slowly trail off until about 1971, where they stopped the system because they knew they were running out of gold reserves. They were being depleted quite quickly. So President Nixon closed the gold window for foreign exchange to redeem into gold in 1971. And so that's when the newest system and the current system, believe it or not, is the petrodollar system. That's where this comes in. So the petrodollar, 1974 to now, in the void left by the Bretton Woods system, it was filled by all currencies turning into fiat. You've probably heard that term recently. It's being used as sort of a slogan against a lot of fiat currencies. Fiat, like it's not a good thing, not backed by anything. That's basically what it means. There's nothing backing the currency in terms of redeemability into a commodity or other thing. And so after the gold embargo, the U.S. reached a deal with Saudi Arabia, and shortly after, many other economic partners joined into high oil-producing countries. And the oil-producing countries said, or the United States says, you are going to only produce oil that you sell in dollars. So you need to sell all your oil in dollars, and in return, we're going to provide military and economic protection to you. So essentially, it's not necessarily a fiat system, but it is. So the US dollar is backed by a right to buy oil, essentially. If you want to buy oil, you need to have dollars. You can't buy it in other currencies, really. And at least that's how the system started. We'll get into how that's changing. And so we're going to touch on the impact of the petrodollar currently. And so the U.S. is only 24% of global GDP, yet surprisingly enough, almost half of global payment is in dollar. International loans are overwhelmingly in dollar. And foreign exchange reserves, this is very important because this is a very big number, is in dollars. So how do the economics of this system work? So the U.S. needs to sell dollars to provide liquidity into the system. So to sell dollars, basically you need to create more dollars, if that makes sense. The dollars that need to be sold are not created yet because there is so much demand for liquidity. And this leads to a strong dollar because if you know basic supply and demand, supply goes up like that, demand goes down like that. If supply is super high, you're going to have a pretty high price. And so that happens even in the FX market with the dollar. The dollar has been historically strong, which actually leads, if you remember, leads to a negative trade balance because if your home currency appears very strong, foreign exports are going to seem really cheap, and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to buy those exports instead of exporting yourself. You're going to buy those imports, rather, instead of exporting. Sorry about that. And it's actually going to make your exports to other countries seem very expensive because they are in dollars. And so that essentially destroyed the export market for the United States. So here's a chart of that to show you this is the case. This is where the petrodollar system began, seemingly minute trade balances up until that point. But as the petrodollar system progressed, we really only ran deficits, only a couple surpluses here or there, but trade deficit basically is the only way for us to go because of that strong dollar. In this, if you ever hear politicians talk about we need to bring back manufacturing jobs, this is what they're talking about. These are the manufacturing jobs that left. This is the trade balance here. We, instead of producing a lot of these goods in the United States, like say textiles, like a cloth t-shirt or something, we are importing that from overseas. Cars, you name it. You pretty much name the good, we're importing it from overseas. And that changed from here when it was America made. That was how things were. And then instead of exporting goods, we export dollars. We don't export goods, we export financial assets denominated in dollars for the world to use in order to do a lot of things, but fundamentally buy oil. Buy oil and serve as collateral on loans and for currencies. And so this pretty much turned our economy from a manufacturing commodity economy where there was lots of real productivity to a financialized economy where basically all we do is sell financial assets. And you'll notice that if you look at who are all the rich people in this country, they're mostly based on financial assets, a lot of them. You could say that's investing, but basically it's financial assets. They're in finance. Not very many people getting rich as a manufacturer in the United States anymore. And so here's a chart I thought I'd include. This is in the green here, we have the dollar index, which is just the dollar as compared to goods. And then we have the money stock. And this basically shows despite the United States increasingly deflating away the currency, our dollar has remained relatively strong in terms of foreign exchange. So because it's relatively strong, that tells us that the demand for dollar is what's propping this up. The demand for dollar has remained so high that we can basically sell these dollars to, if we look back here, finance these deficits. We're selling dollars for goods. And you could say that, oh, that's not good because we're becoming poorer. But if things go in a bad way for the other side, where the dollars basically just get inflated away, these trade balances don't matter because we exported dollar assets, which is an interesting thing to think about. Okay, here. So we have petrodollar weaknesses. So the Triffin dilemma. This basically says that if you're the reserve currency, you're going to have a conflict between what the international community wants, the global economy wants, and what the home economy wants. So the home economy is going to say, we don't want to run all these trade deficits to provide reserves for the world, but the world economy is going to say, we want these reserves so that we can finance the global economy. And there's a clash there between providing reserves and running trade deficits. And here we are. The trade deficit weakens the dollar, and providing reserves can weaken the dollar as well. So it can lead to a vicious cycle if things get out of control of a weaker and weaker dollar when the petrodollar ends. That's how it's going to end, with a very weak dollar. And that's going to lead to inflation and a whole other host of things that frankly are very difficult to predict. So, and then here's another thing. The petrodollar system started with the United States importing a lot of oil. And now China is the largest importer of oil in the world, and it imports the most commodities as well too. So this statistic here I think is actually a big deal because China's not going to want to buy things in dollars. They're going to want to buy things in their own currency, which they can control and manipulate at will. And so the U.S. percentage of global GDP is falling. It's less of a presence in the global economy. And the United States has used military coercion to force compliance from oil-producing nations that stopped selling in dollars. So think of Iran. Think of Saddam Hussein pricing oil in euros and then doing that for a little bit, and then the United States invades when there really was nothing wrong there besides selling oil in euros. Well, maybe not nothing, but and then also Venezuela there's a democratically elected leader. Then they started trying to sell oil in euros, and then the CIA overthrew them and installed somebody who would sell oil in dollars. So there is that to be aware of, the political aspect of this. And it'll be interesting to see how this system ends. I think the answer to the question of the modern currency system is we're really going to need a new one pretty soon, within the next 50 years, which is pretty soon in terms of world economy. So tell me what you think. Do you think that the petrodollar system is going to continue? Do you think it's going to change? And why don't you tell me why? Thanks.
The Bretton Woods Conference held towards the end of World War II, 1944, here on our own state of New Hampshire, and it also created the International Monetary Fund. The Bretton Woods Conference was the major conference to set up the post-war international economic system, and it was dominated by two personalities, one from the United States in the form of Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official, and the British side by John Maynard Keynes, the great economist. And of course, there was a power imbalance between the two. Keynes, of course, was a brilliant economist, but Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, had the financial and military might of the U.S. behind his positions. And this led, in the British side, to this following doggerel. In Washington, Lord Halifax whispered to Lord Keynes, "It's true they've all the money bags, but we have all the brains." At any rate, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund was to manage international financial crises. And as Mike Musa, late director of research at the IMF, used to say, we've managed to have a lot of them. And of course, on the World Bank side, the World Bank is designed to channel money to developing countries and alleviate poverty. And I think at best it can be described as a work in progress. At any rate, the Bretton Woods Conference stands as a major conference setting up the post-World War II system. And we are obviously listening. We still have its institutions with us today. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Eric Rauchway from the University of California at Davis, who is working on a major book on the origins and the impact of the Bretton Woods institutions and the Bretton Woods Conference. He is an expert on the Great Depression and the 1930s and 40s and has written a number of books, including The Great Depression and the New Deal, a very short introduction published by Oxford University Press in 2008, Blessed Among Nations, How the World Made America, published in 2006, and Murdering McKinley, The Making of Theodore Roosevelt's America, published in 2003. This talk is sponsored by the Economics Department, the History Department, with generous financial support from the Rockefeller Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rauchway.
Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks to all of you for turning out on this rainy afternoon. I hope I can be sufficiently entertaining when I talk about monetary and financial conferences, which I know is what you all have as an idea of fantastic entertainment. Actually, today's talk is going to be largely about the politics of adopting the Bretton Woods agreements, not so much about the tete-a-tete between Keynes and White, partly because I think that the tete-a-tete between Keynes and White has been covered in the literature, and partly because I think we give too little attention to the ways in which the Bretton Woods Agreement were made law and institution by the United States government, which not only had all the money, but also all the power at the end or towards the end of World War II. So I want to talk today about how the Bretton Woods arrangements came about because the Roosevelt administration was able to mobilize on its behalf a coalition of farmers and farm associations, of populists, of labor unions, and at least a sufficiently symbolic number of bankers and businessmen to support its bill for the Bretton Woods agreements as it was going through Congress. In other words, it was to a degree the last hurrah of the New Deal in its politics and in its political influence. It's also a lesson, I think, in how the things that we think we know about institutions would have shocked their creators and their originators. The way we think about Bretton Woods today is very different from the way their creators thought about the institutions as they were putting them together. So first of all, let's think quickly about Bretton Woods as a matter of history. This is probably one of the few audiences in the United States, so I don't have to tell where Bretton Woods is. right? It's quite close to here. As you know, it's a very nice skiing and resort town. The Mount Washington Hotel, which you see depicted here, was home to the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which was held over 3 weeks in July of 1944. A few things about that. There is no such thing institutionally as the United Nations in July of 1944, not in the sense that we know it today. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference would be held later that summer, the San Francisco Conference in the spring of 1945. The United Nations referred to the nations united in the fight against fascism. It was Roosevelt's favored name for the Allies, the United Nations. It included the Latin American nations and, of course, the Western European nations, including some governments in exile, like, of course, the French and the Danes, who were there as observers. So the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference is held in July of 1944. As I say, there's no such thing yet, it really is the United Nations. This conference is part of giving it body. Second thing I want you to think about, as Doug correctly says, is part of the creating the post-war order, but of course the war is still on. Right? This is only a few weeks after D-Day. American forces, along with Canadian forces and British forces, are still fighting their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. This is a conscious decision made by the Roosevelt administration to try to avoid the errors of Versailles. They understood that by waiting till the war was over in 1918, 1919, one of the things that they had done was to allow sort of goodwill to dissipate among the Allies. And they wanted to avoid that problem by having the conference at a time when Allied cooperation was indeed at its peak, including not only the US and the UK, but also the Soviet Union, who are represented at Bretton Woods. Another thing that they were doing to try to avoid the mistakes of Versailles is, of course, that's one of the reasons they're holding it in New Hampshire. Senator Charles Tobey, who's a senior member of the Senate Banking Committee, is a Republican of New Hampshire. Key thing is he's a Republican. Right? One of the Wilson administration's major errors was not admitting Republicans into the delegations at Versailles. The Roosevelt administration was keen to have Republicans on board from the start. That's one of the reasons that the conference is held in New Hampshire. The other reason is they wanted to hold it in the summer, but someplace cool. Apparently they overdid it. All the delegates had to bring their wool socks, or so we are told. Right? So when we speak of Bretton Woods, this is the conference that we're speaking about, and of course the location that we're speaking about. The other thing that we speak about is the system that is established at this conference. The International Monetary Fund, better known simply as the Fund or the IMF these days, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, at the time generally just called the Bank, later the World Bank or IBRD less frequently, and the thing that we probably nowadays don't think about because it doesn't exist anymore, but which is in fact the foundation of the whole system, is a system for coordinating exchange rates, or the so-called adjustable peg. The idea was that by maintaining exchange rates at a fixed but adjustable level, you would be able to facilitate trade without having the problems that attended the gold standard, i.e. having to stick to the gold standard even in times of great financial crisis, which a lot of the economists there thought had caused great problems during the Depression, the recent Depression. So that's sort of a rough précis of what we're talking about when we talk about Bretton Woods. Now, when we think of Bretton Woods' institutions and its legacy today, I think of something very different. These are the Twitter results for a search for Dominique Strauss-Kahn on May 15th, 2011. The number one result was that nobody told Dominique Strauss-Kahn that being director of the IMF doesn't mean you get to do to people what the IMF does to countries. This is the number one result, mind you, right ahead of the IMF's own statement. Right? This tells us something about how people regard the IMF nowadays, and of course, as Doug rightly pointed out, people tend to view the World Bank as at best a work in progress and sometimes a lot worse than that. So when we think about the IMF now, though, we think of it sort of as the agent of what we have lately been calling austerity policies. Right? The agent that will impose austere policies on countries that are struggling already in exchange for extending credit to such countries, nowadays on the periphery of Europe in some cases. Right? They will urge them to dismantle or defund components of their welfare state and various other forms of state spending. If we compare this to how the IMF was regarded in 1945, both by its proponents and by its opponents, we'll see that in fact it was rather different. And I'm giving you now 1945 because, as I said at the outset, the adoption of Bretton Woods is, I think, at least as important as the thinking up of Bretton Woods. Right? The Roosevelt administration, having secured the agreement of the 44 countries at the conference, then has to get it through Congress, which, as you know, of course, again, was something they were unable to do. The Wilson administration was unable to do in 1918, 1919, right? They had their agreement and then they couldn't get it adopted. So the effort to get it adopted and the way that they talk about the agreements when they're trying to get it adopted are at least as important, I think, as the thinking up of the agreements. For example, when we think of labor's stake in Bretton Woods, which is not something necessarily that we would think of nowadays, we see that labor in 1945 regarded Bretton Woods plans as links in a chain we had to forge to make a better world. Right? Nowadays, of course, we tend to think of unions as being opposed to the IMF and globalization and all that they represent. Not so in 1945. Right? The same when we think of another pamphlet that was funded by the CIO's PAC in 1945. It's not only easy to understand, but it's very important to the average citizen. Again, we tend to think of Bretton Woods as something fairly abstruse that doesn't touch the ordinary person, the man in the street. They were keen in 1945 to say, no, it's just as much about bread and wages as it is about a village in New Hampshire. Bretton Woods, as its origin was, as I set out, was about creating a coalition for international capitalism. Right? That's the idea, to revive the international capitalist system, to revive trade, to revive capital flows to the degree possible among countries. That would include bankers, farmers, and unions, premised on an argument that Bretton Woods would lead to full employment and increasing prosperity. It was tied to the full employment bill that had gone before the United States Congress and the idea of high and rising real wages. And again, as I say, I want to talk about 1945 rather than 1944 because I want to think about the politics of this. The conference is held in the summer of 1944. Almost as soon as the conference concludes, it's set aside by the White House because they go into presidential election mode, and nobody wants to hear about exchange rates, adjustable or not, during presidential election season. Once you get past presidential election season, you're largely into the holidays and Christmas. It's not till January of 1945 that the Roosevelt administration again picks up Bretton Woods and seeks to have it adopted by Congress. And they seek to have it adopted by Congress. They don't seek to have it adopted as a treaty by the Senate. This is a strategic decision that's made by the Roosevelt administration on the grounds that, having conversed with congressional leadership, it would actually be easier to get it through both houses of Congress on a simple majority than to try to get it through 2/3 of the Senate. Having gone through this process, they decide that they're going to be able to sell Bretton Woods. Now, let me talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of what it is that they're selling and how they got to this point. When we think about these things, as Doug pointed out, we tend to think about the intellectual conflict between Keynes and White. We also tend to think about Bretton Woods as an Anglo-American stitch-up, as they would say in the UK. In truth, I think it's important to realize that Bretton Woods began before Keynes and White began their discussions, and it outlasted those discussions as well. The system that we now think of as Bretton Woods shows up much, much earlier in Treasury records, as early as 1934, when Harry Dexter White is not actually working for the Treasury yet, and is asked by Jacob Viner, an economist consultant to the Treasury, to report on what kind of monetary standard the United States ought to have. This is in 1934. The context of this is that in 1933, as one of his first actions as president, Roosevelt took the dollar off gold. In taking the dollar off gold, he suspended convertibility of all gold, of all paper dollars into gold, and a few weeks after that, required Americans to turn in their specie to the Federal Reserve. So they ended up with a lot of gold and silver on hand. At the time, Roosevelt said privately, or off the record, that he regarded this as a permanent move. They were moving to a managed currency. But they weren't sure as yet what that managed currency would look like. And in 1934, in January of 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which permitted the president to peg the dollar value of gold, which he then did, at $35 to an ounce. It was sometimes after this that Viner asked White to write up a report on what kind of monetary standard the United States ought to have. White replied at considerable length, sort of a 300-page report, and he said, look, we could have a gold standard like we did before, which we pledged to convert the dollar to gold at a certain rate. That would carry with it an increased volume of trade. It would also make it more difficult for us to have our own domestic monetary policy in times of crisis. And in my estimation, White said, the advantages to trade will be far outweighed by the disadvantages of keeping to the gold standard in times of economic crisis. We could have a flexible exchange rate, White said, but this would not be respectable and would not induce confidence in the dollar. There is a third way, says Harry Dexter White in 1934, and that is to have what I call the international gold standard. White says, now I'm using the term gold standard in this phrase, international gold standard, purely as a courtesy. People like the words gold standard. It's not really going to mean anything in terms of the actual functioning of the system. We'll have the dollar nominally pegged to gold for international purposes as we do now. We will pledge to maintain that exchange rate, but we also reserve to ourselves the right to move it when the dollar has reached what he called the safety point in this document. This is, in other words, the origin of what we now call the adjustable peg, which is the basis of the Bretton Woods system. We will have a pegged value for the dollar to other currencies, but we will move it when we need to. And he said, in order to forestall moving it, we will have a large fund, a large monetary fund, which will trade internationally. It will be composed of all the species that we have just taken away from the American people, some billions of dollars, and we will use it to trade in foreign exchange in order to maintain our exchange rate to prevent our having to devalue it. The bigger the fund, White writes, the better, because the longer you can forestall an inevitable devaluation, maybe render it not inevitable at all. So this is the origin. You get your International Monetary Fund and you get your adjustable peg in the context of the Roosevelt administration's having gone off gold in 1933 and trying to decide what to do next, in the context also of trying to preserve the maximum flexibility in recovery from the Depression. This is what's on the mind of Harry Dexter White. It's this report that gets him hired permanently to the Treasury and put in charge ultimately of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is the large fund that is used to try to maintain the exchange value of the dollar. So Bretton Woods has its origins in the very earliest part of the Roosevelt administration. In this same report, White says the important thing is to attempt to arrive at conclusions on the best course of action, irrespective of popular opinion, and then attempts to swing public opinion. White himself and Keynes are involved in the first part of this sentence, right? Arriving at the best course of action that they possibly can, irrespective of popular opinion. It's the second part of this opinion in which White and Keynes are actually shunted aside politely, and the Roosevelt administration swings into high gear. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Keynes is British. And ultimately, however many brains the British may have, they are declining as a world power. The British government has made the decision not to consult Parliament about Bretton Woods until the American Congress reaches a decision itself. So they've decided to wait and to see what it is that the United States will do. So Keynes is basically out of the picture after the conference in 1944, at least for the time being. White is taken out of the picture because he's not very polite, basically. Morgenthau allegedly once threw him out of the meeting for using four-letter Anglo-Saxonisms, and he was considered too likely to do this in the public and sort of was kept, therefore, on the back burner for the time being. And the idea of getting Bretton Woods through became the project of Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the other men at the top of the Roosevelt Treasury. Now, you may say to yourselves, what kind of challenge was this? Why should it have been difficult at all? Well, there was a substantial argument against the Bretton Woods agreements. And the argument against these agreements came from a sector which might surprise us today, which is to say from American bankers. The American bankers were very thoroughly and in some cases violently opposed to the Bretton Woods Agreements Act and mounted a substantial public campaign against it. Contrary to Harry Dexter White's argument that the larger the fund would be, the better it would be, because the longer you could forestall revaluations of currency, the American Bankers Association took the position that the large fund was dangerous because it could be inflationary. The bankers took the view that the danger of inflation after the war was possibly the greatest danger facing the world, and overexpansion was a threat to be avoided. Again, peculiarly given the way that we think about the Bretton Woods institutions now, the bankers favored the adoption of the World Bank and opposed the adoption of the International Monetary Fund. It's partly because the bank was a bank and it worked on banker-like principles, whereas the fund was a sort of peculiar entity that they professed, anyway, not properly to understand in terms of its extension of credit to member nations. It's partly because the World Bank was sold as primarily being an agency to guarantee private lending rather than to make loans of its own, so bankers naturally viewed it as a way of facilitating their own business, whereas the International Monetary Fund would quite possibly take away the business of international banks that had done currency exchange prior to this point. So the concern was that if credit, and by credit they meant currency, was too easily available, governments would use it irresponsibly. That's what the Financial News, anyway, had to say. If you looked at the head of the Bank of International Settlements, Thomas McKittrick, he suggests really what we need to do is to reduce costs. We could deflate ourselves to prosperity, as some cynics nowadays say, right? Then unemployment would be short-lived. That what we really needed to do, the bankers said, was to substitute, we could not substitute, rather, for balancing budgets, these strange new institutions like the International Monetary Fund.